Now, I was in my mid 20s, approximately around at this time, and I was living in a rural area, right? Kind of about maybe an hour away from the city I was near, and at the time, I think I moved from another state not long before, but I'm talking about the experience I had when I first went to just selling cars, right? Selling cars. And the thing is with selling cars, right? When you first start doing it, right? You're typically working for an established dealership, right? But I was living in a rural place and I was looking for something I could do in the city to, have a job. And, I eventually came across a Chevy dealership. And so I went in and applied, and I applied maybe to some other dealerships once or twice in the past. Of course, there's a little bit of an interview process, and I already had some sales experience, so it wasn't like I was totally naive. But I went in there and thinking, well, what is this like? I mean, it's a bit of a higher priced sale than what I was used to previously. I was used to selling something for maybe a couple $1,000s, where this was like, 20, 40, $50,000 plus maybe, right? For a new car, or just for a used car, maybe, an extra 3 to 10 or 20 grand. And so maybe I might have thought, oh, well, this is a bigger ticket item. Maybe I can make some more money. But surprisingly, I already made some reasonable money in sales before that, to where, like, it was comparable to maybe selling cars, right? Because I think about when you make the commissions on a car, when I first got there, I was thinking, well, you can make some pretty good money potentially. You could make up to, a couple $1,000s or more. It's possible. Most of the time you might make an extra $500 to $1,500 on a sale, right? Sometimes you get a higher ticket sale and or something that is more gross or whatever it is, but starting out at the Chevy dealership, a little bit of an interview process. But what I learned there is, just in a short time, right? So I was only working there for maybe a couple of months. But, you're working around a team of people, so you are team oriented. You typically have your own little cubicle or office area you can work out of depending on how big the dealership is, and you typically have a table to sit down at with your clients, right? So, but having a lot of inventory was helpful, of course. So we had new vehicles and used vehicles. I was mainly doing used vehicles, so I was in a smaller side lot, but I had a manager there that was fairly easygoing. We didn't get a ton of traffic, but we got enough traffic to take an extra 2 to 3 or 4 ups a day. What we call an up, right? What's an up? Well, that's a client, a potential, not a client, but a prospect, a prospective client, I should say. And when you're going to take an up, you want to be ready to go, basically at any time, because you never know when someone could walk on the lot, right? Maybe you're familiar, maybe you've been in car sales. Maybe let me know if you drop a line. Let me know if you've been in car sales, or how long you've been experienced, or what the ups and downs, or maybe the pros and cons in your experience. So I was only there for a short time, like I say, but when I first got started, it was just the mindset of doing more presentations or demos in this case, right? Taking people out for a test drive, finding a car that actually fits them, if that makes sense, because sometimes it depends on factors like not only what they would use practically. Do they have a family, or are they going off-roading, or are they looking for something they can travel long distances, travel like, interstate, etc., business, or are they looking for, whatever they're looking for as far as the practicality of what they're looking to buy, but also the affordability, right? What's in their budget range, right? What's in their budget range, and then also take into into account the fact that a lot of people are going to have a trade-in, right? Half the time or more, right? Depending, on what they're currently driving. Maybe they have an old beater that's not really worth anything. The dealership might offer them, a discount essentially on the car, basically take their old car. Maybe if it's a beater, they might not really be wanting to offer any money for it, but they might offer, some kind of trade, maybe a little bit of a discount. Maybe they don't even want to take the car. That's possible. I think our dealership would take most any trades because most people are driving a reasonable enough vehicle already, but it just kind of depends on what they're trading in. Maybe their car is already still worth, $10,000, or $5,000 or whatever. Maybe it's a newer car and they're just upgrading from, 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago, which could happen, right? But I think most of the time that, people want to, they'll hold on to their car for at least 5 or 10 years or more. But when they trade it in, do they have any reasonable trade-in value on it, right? So that's a factor. I had to learn all these things. It was just, basically learning from other guys. Maybe I think we had one or two ladies that were also selling in that office. So it was a maybe reasonable-sized dealership. I don't know how many cars we had on our lot. Probably at least, I don't know, a couple hundred or maybe or more. And maybe like about 8 or 12 reps, right? Sales associates, right? Sales associates, and 8 or 12, maybe more. So maybe because we'd have shifts, and I think if you're familiar with, auto sales on a dealership lot, you know what it's like. You want to be on call at any time because you never know when that prospect is coming on the lot to potentially buy a car, right? So you want to be ready to go, and that mindset is that's the one thing that for me I felt like was kind of a con to it. 'Cause I'm kind of used to being active and doing something actively, but really the reality in many cases for a lot of dealerships is that you're sitting around a lot of the time. Unless you're really proactive, meaning making phone calls, appointments, referrals, really taking action to really prospect. Unless you're doing that consistently, a lot of times you might just stand around the lot waiting for someone to walk on the lot and ask people how they're doing, trying to spark a conversation, see if you can gauge what they're maybe looking for, or, their readiness to actually do something. But at the same time, also really just, being ready to take those ups. Like, that's really the biggest thing, honestly, in my experience, right? Being ready to talk to these prospects that are coming into the lot and take as many as you can. It might have been a rotation or something like that. There's people coming in the lot and say, oh, well, it's your turn, or such and such it's turn to go approach that prospect, or maybe someone's just more willing, or someone's more on call, someone's just more ready to go. That's what it often really comes down to, right? Because a lot of salespeople, I would find, a lot of times they might look a good game and talk a good game, but in reality, they're not, ready to go a lot of the time. That's, I'd say, 50% or 70% of the problem. They're just not ready to go. They're not ready to go get the prospect and approach the prospect. So, like I said, I was only here for about 2 months, and at least one of those months, I was actually tied with one other rep for the top sales associate, which was not like huge numbers or anything. I think I was sold like 7 cars, but I managed to sell like 7 cars, and and maybe a few of them were some reasonable commissions. So you're earning commission, but also, if you're working at a dealership and being on call, you're probably being paid some minimal hourly wage to be there. Probably like minimum wage or something like that in many cases, many states, but you might just be like 100% commission. And for many people, that's fine. They feel comfortable. They know that they're going to be regularly selling, a few cars, and, as long as they're working at their dealership. That's the way I kind of felt like there. You have people regularly coming in, but if you really want to be proactive and you really want to like move up and, something like that, you really want to get proactive about really bringing more people onto your lot, meeting more people, giving your cards out, advertising and marketing in other ways, and word of mouth, right? Word of mouth, a lot of word of mouth, I would say, is things that could help, right? To really sell more vehicles, right? But, the market's always looking for new vehicles. There's always people looking to upgrade their vehicle if they can afford it. Same time, the market's kind of shifting around in different ways, and I think a lot of new vehicles are more expensive than ever. Like now people are spending, it's crazy, just for, typical Suburbans, it's more like 70 and 90,000, where, to 10, 20, 30 years ago, it's more like, 35 to 50,000 on the top end in most cases, unless you really had, LT and everything, the trims like high end or something, leather interior, all that stuff, But yeah, I think, a lot of us recognize that a lot of people don't, right now are also keeping what they have, like kind of like selling their homes, or, right now they're holding on to what they have for a little while because it's kind of like a buyer's market in a certain sense. Although a lot of buyers can't afford or can't qualify for, what's available in the market, maybe in many cases. But bottom line, there's just a lot of consumerism. People are always going to need vehicles, right, until they totally transform or whatever. Bottom line, you get the idea. There's always going to be people needing vehicles. So you figure, well, if I just go to a lot and start working there, you're probably going to make some money, right? Make some reasonable money. And I would imagine selling cars for a full year, you probably can make at least reasonably, typically at least 50,000. But you really want to get more serious and certainly make six figures. You know what I mean? Depends on what you're doing, how focused and excited, motivated you are about it. But like I said, I was just learning from other people there. Maybe I'd read a few sales books before that. I'd been in some kind of appliance sales before that. It wasn't like I hadn't done anything. And I do speak about that in another video if you want to check out any of that. But, the thing is just being friendly and approachable, being ready to go, right? That was one of the things I say a lot of people fail on. But also not, being focused on the trainings, right? Same time, it's not necessarily super complicated once you understand, what you're trying to do. You're being consistent, you're being ready to go, you're asking enough probing questions to get a sense of what your prospect needs, right? What's a good fit for them, what their intentions are, right? What they want to get out of the situation, and when their trade-in situation, right? Basically, so if they have one, certainly want to evaluate that. A lot of times if you're working in a dealership with some support, you have departments, finance department, maintenance, service department, stuff like that. But if you're in a smaller dealership, you have to kind of be ready to kind of navigate all this stuff between you and your maybe a small team of managers, right, or whoever's there. Just being ready, making sure, if you're going to run a dealership, I mean, obviously you have to track your inventory and keep stuff locked up at night and all that stuff is secure. Security is important, right? But if you're the salesperson just starting out, I would say for getting started in auto sales, I would say just be super coachable, right? In terms of saying doing whatever your manager suggests to the best of your ability, especially when you're learning, right? And then you kind of get a little bit more your own style, right? But one of the biggest things really too is also like once you've done a presentation with somebody, maybe you've taken them out for a test drive, maybe you've evaluated their trade, and the main thing is to really, can you get them down to the table to show them the numbers, right? Can you get them down to the table to show them the numbers, right? And that's kind of maybe a potentially casual thing. It's an assumptive thing. It's hey, you have a quick few minutes, I can show you what it looks like, or, go over, you have a way of saying it that maybe is kind of, your manager probably has, whoever's working there probably already has some proven things they're doing, right? But also read some other sales books, maybe, right? Like, Zig Ziglar is really good. Maybe you're familiar with Zig Ziglar. Zig Ziglar, I'm sure many of you are. If you're listening to this video, maybe let me know if you've read any of his books, maybe, right? And if you haven't, I would encourage it, right? But also, who's the number one? Joe Girard, right? Joe Girard is really well known for being able to teach how to sell a car, right? Why? Because he was in the Guinness Book of World Records, right, as the number one car salesman of all time, right? So what did Joe Girard do? He went out and sold about 7 cars every day, right? 7 cars every day, right? Something like that. No, don't quote me on that. It may be a give or take, but you get the idea, right? And he had his own approaches, right? He had a number of things he would do to stack the deck in his favor, right? So I think I might have read his book maybe at that time or before that or maybe after that. I'm not sure exactly when, but that was, a good experience to really get a grasp on how someone else had achieved such high level of results doing that. Now, I never pursued that on the long term because, I got into recruiting and other projects. But, I would say if you're getting into car sales, like I said, be coachable, right? Have an optimistic, enthusiastic attitude, but also don't just hang out so much with the people who aren't ready to go, right? Don't get too much of a small talker. Be the leader in the dealership by being, calm, quiet. You don't have to try to be the big shot, right? Calmly, subtly assertive, right? About, taking the ups, about being on there ready to go, being willing to put in the time, honestly, really honestly. That's what really makes the money. And in one sense, it's not just really there's different factors, but, bottom line, if you stay there in the evening one night and, somebody else did 2, 3, 4, 5 more people are walking on the lot, that's their time off work. You're willing to put in that extra 2 hours that someone else wasn't, right? You're covering for somebody else, or you're just, maybe it's only 2 of you on the lot, and, you're willing to, you're staying all day, you have to, you don't necessarily want to do that all the time, but maybe if you do it, 3 or 4 days a week, right? You do those longer days. Maybe you can take a day off or two, possibly, depending how your schedule is. And I would say time block yourself a little bit too. You say you give yourself that day or two off, or day and a half off, or something like that. And it depends on what you can get from your dealership, obviously. But you might consider, if they're kind of casually able to put in more time if you're not getting enough of the time on the lot. But to really make that time count, also, like I said, doing whatever you can to prospect outside of just what's coming on your lot, right? The business cards, maybe even some flyers or some other kind of marketing or something that, gets word of mouth, gets exposure, gets familiar. Oh, wait, that's a dealership on such and such street, or whatever it is that, raises awareness of you as the local rep for that, brand, that dealership, whatever it is, right? Standing out as the leading associate in your dealership in that respect, right? Oh, I saw your card over at the restaurant. Wow, it's you. Okay. Somebody comes on your dealership and, oh, that's right. Oh, wow. I saw, they have a little familiarity with you in some way, right? Why not? But think big. Maybe if you want to, really go strong, maybe like you could think about like doing a whole first year, or really getting serious about making it some kind of career or something like that. But that's just my experience. I would say, like, for me, it was all about just trying something new, right? Trying something I hadn't necessarily done before, right? Because I was used to something different a little bit. And so if you're going to experiment, you have to be totally open, receptive to learning. And that's what I did that helped me a little bit. Maybe you've sold for a major, dealership somewhere in your city or something like that. What would you say is the pros and cons maybe for you if you've sold cars, of working in a smaller dealership or a larger dealership, right? The big outlet type dealerships, CarMax and all that type of stuff, right? We have much higher quantity of newer inventories and used cars and so forth. Gives you a lot of opportunity if you're really like paying attention on your lot. There's a lot of times you walk up to the lot and there's nobody even there to approach them. That's what the thing is. Being ready, I think, was the biggest thing that helped me. Is just kind of like I would be there a lot to, it was kind of an easygoing dealership. They would buy us lunch and stuff like that, so it wasn't like I felt a lot of stress. But we did have a couple of managers there that were pretty strong. We have sales training every morning, right? So your dealership might not do any particular sales training if you're in a small dealership. Maybe they do. Maybe they're pretty strong about it. But if they are, they're probably growing. You know what I mean? Let's face it, in one respect. Or maybe a small dealership can do a lot of units with just 2 or 3 people, right? If that makes sense. Because you're attracting the market. Maybe you're in a rural area where a lot of people are looking to buy trucks. And even though it's rural, there's a lot of people still living around. And they're coming to your dealership to buy that certain kind of vehicle, right, that works in that terrain, whatever the local industry is, right, if that makes sense. That's maybe a way to capture a niche. Anyway, I appreciate you listening to this video. It's just a few minutes about my experience selling cars for just a couple months. There's probably some other things I could think about with it. Matter of fact, it's kind of funny, just real quickly before I end landing the plane of this video, just talking about one thing that did happen that was really funny. And my mistake, my bad, but I went to lunch and taking one of the demo vehicles out on lunch, went to a restaurant there and I think I picked up some lunch or something like that. And when I got out of the restaurant, I went back to the parking lot, right? And I ended up unlocked, I don't know if I unlocked the car or what, it was unlocked, but bottom line is I went and sat down and I got ready to try to start the car and I realized I was sitting in someone else's car. So if you can imagine that, I don't know if you've ever done anything like that by accident, right? It was really, I got to get out of here real quick because I realized I was sitting in someone else's car because it looked just like the car that I was driving, the demo that I was driving. I think it was a Chevy Malibu or something like that, So anyway, that was just kind of a funny note. I thought I would add it in there. But in the meantime, like I said, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time to hear me out on this little story. And maybe you had some experience in the car industry and something like that. let me know. Drop me a line. Let me know, And in the meantime, you might even see some interest in another video at the end of this video. So certainly I invite you to watch one. And in the meantime, I want to say thank you so much and see you in the next video.